So, wow, only a couple people are awake. Must have had good lunches. I'm Mohammed Ghassemi. I'm your Academic Research and Careers Co-Chair for the Graduate Student Council this year. And as is the tradition every summer, we put on a panel where we try to talk about nuts and bolts of the academic career search. And given the last couple of years when we've done this, we found that the best way for both the faculty as well as the people in the audience is to have it as unstructured as possible. So we're going to have our esteemed panel talk a little bit about themselves and, how they very, very briefly, maybe 5 minutes each, arrived at their own academic positions. And then we're going to open it up for questions. The format is going to be, we're going to have you queue up on the right side here where we've placed a microphone. But before we begin the process, we want to give our panelists an idea of the makeup of the people in the room. So we're going to have 3 categories. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you fall into either of those 3. First category is first half of your PhD. Raise your hand if you're in that group, roughly. If you're in your first half of your PhD, you think. Okay, no one. Okay. People who are in what they consider second half of their PhD or close to graduation, please raise your hand. Okay. And then the third group are postdocs. Please raise your hand. Oh, okay, great. So you know who your audience is then as you're moving forward. Okay, with that, we will go ahead and begin. I'm just going to, the microphone's here. I don't think you'll have to lean into them. You can just, I think, speak at normal pace and we'll go from there. Please, after you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kai Goosens. I'm an assistant professor in the Brain and Cognitive Sciences department here. I've been here for 7 years. Before this, I was a postdoc at Stanford. That was my first postdoc. I applied for jobs my second year as a postdoc because at the time I knew that it was hard to get a job. And I've always heard that you should strike while the iron is hot. And so I've also heard that the longer you sit around as a postdoc, the harder it is to get a job. So I thought, I'll apply in my second year. Maybe I'll get an interview. And then in my third year, I'll really be ready to apply for jobs. So I applied to maybe 6 places and ended up getting a job offer here at MIT. And so I think part of the success for that was maybe because I wasn't nervous during my interviews, particularly here, because I just thought, well, I'm not going to get a job here anyways, so what does it matter? So I didn't, a lot of people had advice for me about how to prepare for an interview and how you need to look up the research of everybody you talk with and make insightful comments. And I started doing that, and I just found it really stressful. And I just said, screw it. I'm not going to do any of that because I'm not going to get this job anyways. I'm just going to talk about the things I already know. And if I don't know something to say, I'm not going to, I'll find something else to talk about. And I actually think that strategy paid off because I wasn't nervous. I was just myself. I was really comfortable. I actually had a lot of fun during my interview. And so I've been here since then.
I can't give you much help at all based on my experience because I didn't do a job search in the traditional way. I graduated from MIT in electrical engineering. I went to medical school. After that, I went to the residency program. After that, I went to the Air Force because in those days we were at war with Vietnam. Everybody had to go into the military who was in the medical service. I spent 2 years in Albuquerque, New Mexico doing research. And it turned out that at that time, MIT and Harvard had been talking a lot about doing something jointly in medicine and technology. And they just came up with sort of the notion of what became HST. And they were looking for people who had background similar to mine. I wrote a letter to the provost who had been my thesis advisor. So I guess one good thing to do is network, right? And asked whether there was a chance of getting a job. And my attitude was, great, if I can get a job there, it'd be terrific because I'd always wanted to do something at the interface of engineering and medicine. But if that didn't work, I would stay in the Air Force. They would promote me. I would be a major, and I would retire as a general with a great pension plan and be able to get a second job by the time I was 40. Well, as it turned out, I got the job here, I came here, and I've loved it. I've stayed ever since. So I can't help much from the point of view of looking for a job. I can help talk about the process of recruiting people, how we do it, what's important, and what lessons I might pass on to you from the point of view of recruiting.
And one of the people that Roger recruited is me. My name is Thomas Heldt. I'm an assistant professor in electrical engineering and computer science. I'm also with the Institute for Medical Engineering and Science in the Research Lab of Electronics here at MIT. I came to MIT in 1997 as a graduate student and been here ever since. Graduated through the HST Medical Engineering, Medical Physics program, then joined RLE, or what used to be LEES, the Laboratory of Electromagnetic and Electronic Systems, as a postdoc. Stayed there for probably about 4 years or so. Became research scientist and principal research scientist. And then joined the faculty about 2 years ago when the Institute for Medical Engineering and Science was started. My background is in physics, but now I'm compelled to teach classes in electrical engineering. I would amplify what Roger just said. Networking is exceedingly important. In my year, we hired 2 people into IMES. One jointly with chemical engineering, Kwang-Hon Chung, and myself in electrical engineering, and about 200 applications for 2 positions. So it's about a priori probability of 1% that you ultimately get the job. So it's exceedingly important that you develop a network of people that know you, that know about your work, that ultimately can ensure or at least can suggest that you get interviewed. And once you get an interview, that's when your personality, your interaction with the faculty become very important.
So I'm Markita Landry. By training, I'm a physicist, so I got my bachelor's and my PhD in physics, and then made the switch to chemical engineering for my postdoc. So I can talk a little bit about switching fields. I interviewed a few months ago for faculty positions, and I'll be starting a faculty position at UC Berkeley in chemical engineering next year. So I recently went through the ringer. I have not been on any search committees, so I'm not too well equipped to talk about what it's like on the other side and what it's like to recruit and vet candidates, but I can speak to the process of the applications and also interviewing in a variety of different fields, and the types of things to emphasize, the types of questions to expect, and how to present your case for maximizing your chances of getting hired.
Great, thank you so much. So what we'll do now is we'll have you guys queue up here along the right side of the room and use the podium over there to, basically give some questions to the panelists. And you can do that, or you can just sort of, in a very clear way, state the question, and then I'll repeat it so that we have it, for everybody to hear.
I have a loud voice, so maybe I don't need
Perfect.
When you're preparing your research statement, I know there's generally a couple different schools of thought. One is you tailor it to the school's advertisement. Another one is you tailor it to what you want to do, and then leave it up to the school to decide maybe if they are still interested in you or not. I've heard both ends of the spectrum and everything in between. Is there some advice that you can give for saying maybe one way is slightly better than the other one? Because, as we're going through writing, this is the hardest part of the application process for many of us.
Well, I've been now at the other end of the search process, and I think for me most importantly is what has to shine through is your enthusiasm. So yes, usually the search committee has something in mind, and even if they didn't express it very directly in the ad, sometimes the ad is very broad, but they still have something in mind. So the first thing, if you can get intelligence information from the inside, that's very important, right? And if you can get that, then you can tailor it a little bit. But first and foremost, your enthusiasm, your excitement for the kinds of things that you want to do, has to come through. And I would say usually this is more when you actually talk about the stuff that you really want to do, right? Ultimately, you'll be hired for the stuff that you really want to do. I mean, I think it would be a very bad choice to hire someone into a position that they really, don't want to do, right? So I think the enthusiasm, the direction where you actually see your field going, when you project forward 5-10 years, where you would want to be, that has to shine through. And I think it usually comes through better if you actually talk about the things that you're passionate about.
So I think it's a waste of time to tailor your statements. And that's because in general, I think when you apply for jobs, you apply for many jobs. And if you write everything specific to a school, it's a lot of work. And it's not going to pay off, I don't think. And also, I think it's very hard to guess, based on an ad, what somebody is really looking for. I think lots of ads are broad, or they are sometimes looking for things that they don't put in the ad. And so if you make it seem really specific, you might be cutting yourself out when actually they'd find you really interesting. So I don't think the time payoff is worth it. When I wrote my research description, what I did was I went to the websites of really famous people in my field, and I looked at the way that they wrote about their own research. Because one of the things that I knew, I had my research plan, I knew like the kinds of experiments that I wanted to do, the questions I wanted to answer, but I just didn't know how to structure the sort of broader long-term goals. And so I thought, well, how am I going to present the vision I have for my lab in the future? And I said, the way I should do that is to look at people who have a vision for their labs and how do they describe it. And so I went to web pages for, again, famous people in my field who are senior and read their research descriptions of how do they talk about the broad goals of their lab. And some are, really crappy, and so I filtered those out. But some of them are really good, particularly for people who are, for example, like in my field, HHMI investigators. Their HHMI web pages are very good at describing their research. And so I use that as a model for how to write about my own research as a junior person. And that was really helpful to me because I had a lot of experience writing grants, even as a postdoc. But when you're doing that, you're talking about your research on the order of just a few years. And when you present a vision of research for a job, you're talking about your career and a much longer term plan. And I really had no idea about how to write about that. And so that's why I looked to more senior people and how they describe that. So I found a couple web pages where I was like, these are really well written and I find them really compelling. And this is how I'm going to talk about my own research.
There's no question you have to write about what you want to do. Don't even bother with trying to figure out what the school wants to do. For several reasons. One is almost every search you do as a committee or as a department, you have at best a fairly broad idea what you want. What you really want is somebody who can convince you that that's the vision that the department needs to adopt. So you have to sell your vision. Don't try to figure out what the department's vision is, because they probably don't know exactly. But they will recognize a person who has the ability to get them excited. What's the relevance of this research? And where is it going to go in 20 years? Is it fundable? Are you excited about doing it? Yeah, so I agree completely with my colleagues.
Many of the openings will specifically state in them, talk about how your research fits into the vision of the department.
Forget that.
Thank you so much. That helped a lot right there.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun putting together the research proposals, and I didn't really tweak them to individual places. I thought, this is the first time that I'm proposing projects that I really want to do, that I'm very passionate about. And when I reread them recently, it was clear that I wrote that with passion and with curiosity that was, part of what I wanted to do. And I think that came through, and that'll also come through in your interview, because your job talk and your talk will be based on what you're proposing. So everybody in academia runs their own research program, essentially, and they want to have a colleague who's also enthusiastic about their own research program. They don't want somebody in the department who's essentially coattailing, through their job.
So for those of you who did this, did you submit the same research statements and teaching philosophy and the whole same package everywhere? And other places that you interviewed, how many of them, how many places gave you an interview and how many gave you an offer? Like I think you said 6 or 7 places you interviewed to just to practice.
So I applied to 6. I got 1 interview, and I got that job. So those stats are a little off. Had I actually thought I could get a job, I would have applied to many more schools. But I really didn't think it was, I thought I was too early. And so, yeah. So,
So I applied to 1 job and I got that job. So, and I applied at the very tail end when I thought, well, I might as well do it, right? So I kind of hacked my thing together and was able somehow to convince the people. And I'm still, wondering whether sometime I come into the office and they tell me that they made a mistake. But at any rate, so I tailored it. No, not tailored it, but I wrote 1 set, and that was it.
I also wrote 1 set. The only thing I changed or tailored was the cover letter, and that did not require a lot of effort on my part. So it really, like everything else, was the same. I spent a lot of work writing it, but I didn't make it specific to a school.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time putting together the actual proposal, tailored the cover letter. I applied also a year early, so I ended up deferring for a year. I'm still a postdoc here at MIT, deferred for a year to give myself a bit of time to settle into the job and finish the work here. I applied to 15 places, had 11 interviews, and in retrospect, that was a bit much. I wish I'd filtered out a few of those invitations, but I ended up with the job I wanted, so.
I can make one more comment. And where I was specific in my application was the teaching statement, because what I did do is I looked through the offerings that they actually had. And I specifically thought that there are 2 things. There's one thing, which are the current classes that in the curriculum that I would be very comfortable teaching. Service classes, undergraduate classes. For those of you in EECS, 6003, 6041, so the classes here at MIT, right? They need to be covered by the department. Then I looked at the profile and I said, well, what is my background, what are my interests, and where are there strategic gaps in the curriculum that I could fill with the kinds of stuff that I would like to do, right? And I think if I had gone out to other places, I would have actually tailored that part of the teaching statement. But that was not all of it. You talk a little bit, you talk broader. You talk about teaching philosophy, teaching, rationale, and that would have stayed the same.
More questions?
Quick question. You mentioned that you applied to 15 places and you got 11, and in retrospect, you wish you applied to fewer?
I wish, so I was gone for 2 months, and I probably should have, out of the 11, chosen my top, N number to interview at. I think just by the time I hit my 11th interview, I was not even all there. And of those 11, I had a clear, top 5 or 6. The issue there was timing, so I got offers for interviews that I scheduled, and then, 1 or 2 months later, I would get offers for other interviews. And that was in part because I was applying to 2 or 3 different departments. My focus was more on going to a place that had shared resources that would fit with my research goals. So the National Lab, for example, at Berkeley was a big draw. More so than the program itself. So chemical engineering, which is where I ended up. Berkeley's is in the School of Chemistry, which again matches with my kind of more fundamental interests. At other places, chemical engineering is more engineering focused, which is a little further from what I want to do. So that was just a timing issue. Yeah.
I guess the question I had is, so you have an interesting background in physics, you said, and then chemie. So did you apply to like did you apply both to the physics side and the chemie? Were you completely open to what your future will be, or were you very specific about your research?
I was specific in that, so I applied mostly to chemie, a few bio-E, and 1 chemistry. And the way I chose those applications essentially was by looking at the faculty, what the research of the faculty was, and the resources that were available to that department or to that campus, and saying I could see myself fitting in here, the goals that I have fit in here. So it's not even necessary in your job application to say, you know, I can really make use of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. It'll be evident when the faculty is reading through your application. It's like, oh, well, clearly they're going to make really good uses of not just the material resources that we have, but also the other people that are in the department and broadly across campus.
So I have a kind of specific question about letters. Obviously I would have a letter from my postdoc PI, from my PhD advisor. Now, I'm curious about your advice regarding, is it better to get strong letters from other people from my PhD institution who know me really well versus letters from people who maybe know my work, don't know me as well, but would show that, hey, this is somebody at a 3rd institution who has something positive to say? How would you make that, how would you advise that decision?
The letters are one of the most important components of an application. And what you're looking for in the letter, of course, is something about the individual. That's helpful. But the most powerful things in a letter, to me at least, are things that say the work that this person has done is incredibly significant, is cutting edge, is setting a new direction. Now, if your boss says that, that's great, because, you know, your boss can measure you up against others that have been trained in that lab. But if your boss didn't say that, you would be shocked if you read a letter from your boss, right? But if you can get a letter from a leader in the field who has heard you present the work or has perhaps read your papers, that'll carry a lot of weight, and it would be worth trying to find such letters. And then the question is, how do you find them? And how do you introduce yourself to those leaders in the business? And that's something that requires networking, and your mentors can help you with those introductions. You might be able to get to go to another lab and give a seminar. You might participate in a workshop where several people in the business are interchanging their ideas. But yeah, those letters are really important. They're also hard to find. They're hard to get, right?
I don't know.
So I can tell you one thing I did when I was a graduate student at Postdoc, because for whatever reason, my graduate and postdoctoral advisors did nothing to help any of their trainees network. And so one of the things that I did that I really recommend is that when I'd go to a conference and somebody would, a big name person would give a talk, find at least one of them, and I'd go up to them after their talk, and I would invite them out to lunch with me. And it was really scary, especially when I was a graduate student, because I was like, God, what am I going to find to talk about for an hour? But I think almost nobody ever does that. No trainees don't approach other people. And I don't think I ever had somebody say no. And so it's a great way to get one-on-one time with somebody who's not your advisor, who will presumably be in your field if you stay in that field for the rest of your life. And so forming that relationship, that kind of relationship early is really useful. It's very intimidating, but you just have to remember that even well-known people, they're still just people. And they're not there to grill you about your research, and you know a lot about your research. So it really shouldn't be so intimidating. But I think it's really helpful in terms of getting other letters.
I think you in the corner have had your hand up for a while.
So this is a naive question. Normally when you apply for positions, do you apply only for the ones that are advertised, or is there unsolicited applications that you send in? Because I've always found that in certain journals or magazines, the number of positions available are fairly limited, but sending out more applications require you to get more availability of open positions. So.
I always suggest that just because there is no advertisement from a particular group or school, that's not a reason to hesitate sending a cold application. Because many departments have, open searches all the time. They'll have a slot, and they don't necessarily advertise in a particular area, but if they happen to see an applicant who they consider to be fantastic, target of opportunity, they'll go for it. And what do you have to lose? Nothing, right? Nothing. So why not?
Go ahead.
Is there any way to find out if an ad is real, or they have someone in their mind and they open the position for
No.
Is there this?
No, there isn't a way.
How many percent of the ads are real?
Probably most of them are real.
So
Remember, the best local person may get blown out of the water by somebody from outside that they don't know about yet.
So I did inquire with one university that I didn't apply to, where there was an ad that was fairly broad, but there were also some keywords in there that I didn't quite know how to interpret. And so I just called up or sent an email to the chair of the search committee. It's like, I said, how broad is your search really, right? And he sent a very honest email back saying, look, if you're not in these areas, we would still entertain your application, but we are looking in these areas. And so didn't apply.
Go ahead.
For the junior folks, how much did your proposed research differ from your PhD and postdoc labs? And for the more senior people, how much does that matter?
You want a percentage? So you're building a trajectory, right? So in a sense, if you're building, it depends on how junior you are. So in engineering, it's still, some areas of engineering, it's still fairly common that people start interviewing the last, before they actually defend, right? And so their thesis, so not every engineering discipline actually has the culture of a postdoc. And then your research is very much based on your PhD work, right? But you still have to project that forward. If you're a little further out, then one would expect that you're actually building a broader base and that you've branched out a little bit. But again, I think it's a cumulative sum of what you've done in the past and how you got to the point where you are, and how do you project yourself forward from there. So in my particular case, I would say 40% or so, giving you a number now, was still on the basis of the PhD work, but extensions thereof, not really the project that I did for my PhD, but those were extensions, elaborations, and further developments, and then whatever I did after that.
So I would keep in mind that So what you propose when you submit your application, you will eventually build your chalk talk around that. So that's an essential part of the interview. So if you propose something that's very clearly dissimilar from your PhD and postdoc work, it's going to be very hard to defend those ideas in a chalk talk for an hour or more. At the same time, you do want to make sure you're not stepping on anyone's toes. So having that crucial meeting with your advisors, especially if you plan to continue on some of the ideas or some of the same fields, clearly discuss and to show during an interview that you've already had that discussion shows a lot of maturity about how you're going to take your research direction. I think for me it was a bit easier just because my two fields, my PhD field was in optical trapping, and now I'm doing kind of materials research, and it's easier to kind of build a unique research area by merging those two.
I think it's hard to propose a set of experiments that's not related to what you've been doing. I can tell you, having been on search committees here, that applicants who've done that we've deliberately not interviewed people because we said they have no track record in what they're proposing, and they don't have the knowledge base for it. And so the probability of them being able to succeed in that area is low. So I think someone said the idea is to build a trajectory, and the stronger the foundation, the more likely it is for the people to believe that you're the right person to do that research, assuming that they're excited about the research.
Speaking of trajectory, how critical is it that you actually have published work from your postdoc as opposed to maybe just presenting at a few conferences and things like that?
I think it's pretty important. I mean, one of the big evaluation dimensions is productivity, and the only way you can really judge that is by publications and presentations and conferences. So somebody who spends several years as a postdoc and hasn't published more than one paper is dead in the water. Yeah, but it takes a certain amount of time to get research started and finished and published. Everybody knows that. So if you have a situation where you, as you say, you have good publication record based on research that you finished, let's say, 3 years ago, and you don't have many papers yet on research that you're just finishing, okay, everybody understands that. I mean, you have to be human, There are limits to how much you can actually do.
I've seen some people that don't seem human.
I know. Yeah. Yeah.
Sticking with a similar question, how important is it to have first author publications in your postdoc, because you're also mentoring graduate students at the same time, and so how many? I know it's difficult to put a number on it, but how much does it count in terms of first author versus second author or third author, because you're mentoring those students at the same time?
This gets into the question of the environment of a laboratory in which there is intense competition for a few jobs out there and a large number of people fighting to get the jobs, which can lead to a very nasty work environment, clawing up the ladder, even over other people's bodies. Now, my experience is this never happens in engineering, and it happens all the time in biology. That's probably a little unfair, but anyway, so I don't know how to answer that. It is important whether you're the first author or the last author. You can be co-first authors nowadays. And the people who are supervising you would hopefully be willing to express in their letter of recommendation that you're the type of person who gives credit where credit belongs, and not the type of person who squashes a graduate student because you're the postdoc, or who steals ideas from an undergraduate so you can get it on your record. So I'm giving a sermon, okay? I realize that. But I implore you to behave in an upright, fair manner. And if you deserve to be the first author, fine, no problem. If you deserve to be the middle author, then be the middle author and write another paper where you can be the first author, right? But there is a difference between whether you're the first author or the senior author, right? No question about it. But, you know, that needs to be defensible.
I think it's, so in my case, I had a few publications where my contribution was shared, and that was a contribution that I'd made early in my postdoc, but so my advisor showed me the letter that he wrote, and in his letter of recommendation, he outlined specifically what my role was. So there was this one project that had been stalling for a long time, and then, you know, I helped out with it, and he made that clear in the letter. So a good way to go about that would be to have your advisor emphasize your role in those projects in the letter of recommendation. That'll be a lot clearer.
Good advice.
Thank you.
So regarding research statement, typically as a PhD student, I'm working on something very deep, and I may not have that much of space to extend a trajectory. How do I do that in my research statement when I know that I'm going deeper into one area rather than exploring a wide field? So how do I write my research statement for a trajectory down the line for 10 years or 15 years?
Well, I think the question is, where do you see your work going, right? So the research statement, you can be speculative, right? There should be a position of strength from which you actually leverage your PhD or your postdoc, right? But you do have to project forward, right? And then you have to, you know, one way of actually extending your PhD work is to actually go deeper in the direction that you've already done, but you also have to be able to ask yourself the question of, you know, where else is this applicable? Where can I take this? You know, how would I actually branch out if I don't take one project, but now I actually have to have 4 projects, right? So it takes a little bit of time to go through that process and to actually, you can talk to other people to say, you know, it depends on the relationship with your supervisor too. It's like, can we have a discussion, right? Some people wouldn't do that with their supervisor. Some people would do that with other fellow students, you know. But you do have to project out a little bit, right? You can't just keep going in the same direction and further deeper.
Could I elaborate a little bit on that? So if you're reading about somebody's research in an application, and you see a deep, dark hole, right? But no landscape at all, that worries me a lot. You have to say, why is your deep hole significant to the world or to something, right? You don't necessarily have to be an expert in the world, but you do have to relate your detailed, in-depth research to a big, important question to humankind. Because if you can't do that, you'll never get a penny for your research. And you won't get hired.
There's actually a quote, well, I don't know exactly the wording or really even who said it, but it goes something like, scientists are very good at understanding more and more about less and less. And I think this is like a pitfall that when I hear you describe that, that's the first thing that I think is if somebody in my lab came and said, I really want to go deep, I'd say, well, you've got to really watch out that you're just, you know, there's a difference between, and this is something that took me a while to learn, that you can, there's lots of experiments you can do that are scientifically sound, but not all experiments are equal in terms of how important they are. And understanding what's an important question versus just what's the next logical experiment to do in a series of experiments, those are very different things. And so you really have to be careful in your proposal to not just say, well, I'm going to propose the next 5 experiments that one would logically do if one were to continue this project, because that doesn't get at why that's important. That's just sort of doing more. And in the past, and I know at least in my field, that careers were made on that kind of approach to science. But I think there's an increasing recognition now that that has not necessarily yielded cures for disease or anything productive. And so there's sort of pushback for that kind of approach, where you really have to think about, why does the research that you're doing matter? And so when you think about writing something that's deep, the other thing is that when you write about something that's sort of deeper and deeper, if somebody doesn't buy into one of your premises, or they just think like in my field, if I said, well, I really want to understand how a particular brain region functions in some kind of behavior, and they said, well, what if I could show you that, in fact, that brain region's not critical for this behavior? I think it's this other brain region. Then I'm in trouble, right? Because I've hinged my whole thing on understanding this brain region and this behavior. And so I think you have to be really careful about tying yourself too tightly to, like in my field, it would be one brain region, one gene, one pathway, because that's not a viable career anymore in the field that I'm in.
So with that in mind, is there an optimal number of different projects or research directions to propose in your research statement? It sounds like you don't want to focus just on one and hinge your entire career on that subject.
How do you answer a question like that? I mean, you're going to talk about what you know, and and in a research statement, you're trying to convince the department that what you're doing, has a future. You're probably not in a position to describe in great detail all the, specific things you're going to do, but you should be in a position to say, you've done this, and that has set you in this direction, and there's a future to it. But I don't know about counting projects. If you have specific next steps in mind, I don't think that hurts at all to just indicate you're serious about having thought where it's going.
Yeah, I was meant to comment on exactly that. So one thing, so there's different layers, right? One thing is, if I sit, for example, in your chalk talk, and I ask myself the question, okay, if I were to put you in the lab or in the, in the office tomorrow, what would you do, right? What are the immediate projects that you would actually start off? What are the postdocs or the graduate students that you hire for this right off the bat? Something that gives you some early successes, right? That you've thought through, that you've actually kind of gone through the project or experiment, specification stage that you can actually talk about very knowledgeably, and that would actually take you probably the next half year, 3/4 of a year into your project, something that you can build the initial grant applications on, right? Something that you would actually use maybe your startup funds for, right? But then the broader vision, as Roger said, becomes important. Actually, where does this lead you, right? What is, again, coming back to the trajectory, coming back to the impact on society, impactful research, how would that then project forward? Right? But I would like to see, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, something that makes sense to you. If someone were to give you a hunk of money and say, okay, here's your laboratory space, right, go for it, what would you do?
And that's better conveyed in a chalk talk versus the research statement?
So I was just going to say, I structured my research statement and mirrored my chalk talk after that. I actually had a few interviews where the committee for the chalk talk had printed versions of my research proposal, the one that I'd submitted months ago. And they said, how much, say we gave you this startup, what percentage would you allocate to this part versus this part versus this part? And would you put a student or a postdoc on this project? How many? they wanted that level of depth, and they wanted to see that you'd clearly thought about those directions as well as just the research itself.
So my question is about recommendation letters. In most of the ads that I've seen so far, they ask for, say, name and contact information of 5 people. So what does that work exactly? We have to send the statements and then wait for them to contact the recommenders, or the letters also go with the application?
It depends. I'd say half of the applications I submitted, they're all electronic these days, would require me to either put in the names of my recommenders, and then the system would automatically generate an email requesting them. Some of the programs held off, so they would do maybe some sort of first round of cuts and then only request letters if I had made that first round of cuts. So my advisor, a few months in, would email me and say, oh, by the way, this school asked for a letter. So.
But you need to identify who you're going to request letters from. So you have time to write them, get them ready. And then at some point, the school will write you a letter and say, we're waiting for a letter on so-and-so. Send it.
So assuming that you have like 10 potential letter writers, including your PhD advisor, your postdoc advisor, other experts in the field with whom you have collaborated or not, how would you go about choosing the letter writers, and how many letters would you submit?
I don't think you'll have patience for more than 4. I mean, do you ever remember reading more than 4 letters? Or 5.
5, I mean, I would say you could actually, if they request 3, you can give them 4. If they request 5, you can mention 6, so they can choose from, right? They might, even if they request 5, they might not go for all of them, I don't know. I think here, they go for the full 5 letters, right? But I think if you have a list of 10 who to choose from, I mean, it's a strategic move, and it depends on the specifics of the application, of the job, and so on. So, you have to kind of figure out what might make most strategic sense in order to portray your application in the most positive sense for the job that you're applying for.
It's not about quantity, it's about quality. So you don't want to just get more letters, because you think 8 looks better than 4. If you have 4 great letters and then 4 letters, you're diluting the impact of the 4 great ones. So just pick ones that you know will be good, the ones that you think will be the best, and don't just think more is better.
So the question was the criteria to evaluate the candidates? Okay.
Yeah. I actually wrote that down because I knew you'd ask something. How do we evaluate candidates? Well, I mean, I think this captures it. So you have the written material. Cover letter, that's an important letter. Your formal CV, which that actually documents your productivity, right? Make sure that it's accurate and honest, because, for obvious reasons, because they're going to be checked. Your research vision statement is probably way up there near the top of what's important. You're going to have a teaching statement, and you have to write that, and you have to think about it a little bit, but it's not that critical, I can tell you. If you said, I hate to teach, okay, that's important. If you say, I like to teach, and I think I can do X, Y, and Z, and I like to do this, and so that's fine. Letters of recommendation in capital letters, that's really important. Then if you get an interview, and so whether you get an interview depends on the written material, right? If you get an interview, now you have to give a talk, you have to give a seminar, and you have to have interviews, and you may have an informal sort of group interview, chalk talk type thing. And the the seminar you present is extraordinarily important. And it requires and is worth lots of rehearsal. So you have the job of conveying to a group of very diverse faculty members what you're doing, why it's important, and you have to present it in a manner that energizes everybody and that everybody understands. So if you start off talking about your special knowledge, some small detail, you're dead in the water before you start. If you snow them and they don't understand you, you're finished. Okay? So you aim a talk at sophomores in college from different disciplines. Make sure they understand why your research area is important, how it relates, and then you have to give enough detail so that your colleagues in the same department and the same discipline say, okay, this person has their head together and they're prepared to ask you more detailed questions. And the same goes for the less formal chalk talk. And so the key in all of that is communication. Communication skills. And by that, I mean you can speak English. For those of you who are international students, if you do nothing else while you're at MIT, learn to speak English extremely well. Do not hang around with your friends from your native country. Hang around with Americans. Don't talk Chinese, Korean, talk English. Force yourself to do it. Take classes. Teach high school kids in Cambridge so you get used to, thinking and talking in English. And in terms of, your ability to communicate in writing and in technical terms, get every chance you have to participate in writing proposals, every chance you have to give technical talks in your lab. Ask for them. See if you can do 2 or 3 a year at least. And make sure that your friends, your colleagues give you honest feedback. That was a terrible talk. You snowed everybody the first paragraph or, etc. Get honest feedback so you can really feel increasingly comfortable with communication. And finally, which is something I always felt was extremely important and to communicate to graduate students when I was a housemaster, is please get involved in campus leadership opportunities. Learning how to interact with people, learning how to effectively communicate your ideas, to argue for positions, to write budgets, to write plans, is even more important, I think, than the details of what you're learning in class and in your lab. And many times, and by the way, you're not all going to be professors. Okay? We train too many PhDs who want to just be professors. So learn about other jobs as well. And I can tell you that the skills you learn in interacting and leading people are probably the most important skill in getting jobs and doing well in both industry and in academia. That was a long-winded answer to that question. But I wanted to get it off my chest.
I want to really quickly echo the idea that you should be honest in your job application. You'd think that would be obvious, but I can think of it like in the last year, somebody applied for a job here at MIT who said he had a joint appointment at some other university, and then some of the people in the search committee were looking for him in that department, couldn't find it, contacted the department, turned out it's totally fabricated. So he actually interviewed, but as part of his interview, they were like, what the hell, guys? And so he obviously didn't get the job because you can't overcome something like that. So don't compromise your integrity trying to get a job, because you compromise it, you're not going to get it back. It can cost you in the long run, so don't do it.
Could you speak up?
So I was wondering, you said you get like hundreds of applications for like one or two positions, and obviously your time is very important. So how do you narrow it down to like a shorter list? Like what are the criteria they look for? Do you read the entire application, or something that are really necessary that you can discount various applications faster? So in terms of evaluation, like do you look for like a certain number of publications, certain kinds of journals, certain pedigree of like famous labs, or that kind of stuff?
So step number one is the department chair goes through them and throws some out. Usually not a lot, but some. It's the same process in admitting graduate school students, right? You filter out some that are not competitive. Then you have a committee, and you divide your applications up. So each committee member gets a reasonable number to look at. Each application gets 2 or 3 people screening it, giving it a grade, right? And that way you get a hierarchy of applications, and you start to focus more on the top ones. And then they get looked at by the whole committee. And, you know, you look at them in the way you said. What does this person represent in terms of potential research and impact and productivity, letters? Yeah.
I always read the research statement first, because I think that's where it's really easy to pick out people who are competitive and people who aren't. And that's ultimately what matters, is did they write about the research in a compelling and exciting way that makes me excited and think, oh, that would be a great colleague to have here. And so if you have a really compelling research statement, then you start probably the next thing you look at is the letters of recommendation. You say, well, I think this person sounds great on paper. What do other people think of them? And then you look at their CV for their publications. I think those are, at least in my field, the top 3 things: the research statement, the letters, and the publication record.
So if you're not sure about academia, what questions should you be asking yourself?
For me, the question was, do I want to teach? Right. You can do research in a lot of different places. You can mentor people in a lot of different places. For me, the really defining difference one of the defining differences between industry and academia is teaching. Right? Interacting with young people of all, ages between, 17 and 20-some, right? So I think that for me was sort of the bifurcation, right? The other thing is that do you want to be your own boss, right? You can start a company somewhere you need to get the money from, so you're beholden to some people. And, no small measures, actually, being a professor is not that much different from running your startup company. You also have to get money from somewhere, right? Ultimately, you decide if in an academic position what's being done. If you go into industry, that is taken somewhat away from you, right? But for me, the most important defining feature was, do I want to teach? And the answer for me was yes.
Is that true that the longer you stay in postdoc, harder it would be to get a job?
So the question was, the longer you stay in postdoc, the harder it is to procure a position? Is that the question? Yeah.
I think it's true. It's probably field specific, but there's some amount of time in a field in which it's generally accepted that you will come in, you can get a project up and running, and you should start having papers come out from that. And then there are, there's lots of reasons things can take longer, but in general, the bar for a postdoc who's been in a lab for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, it grows exponentially for what the payoff needs to be for you to be viewed as productive. There's a lot to be said for, I think, choosing the right kind of project so that you don't get stuck in a project that has a lot of sort of dead work in the front that's not going to get published, but that kind of needs to be done before you can actually do the experiment that will be published. That's not a good thing for a postdoc to do. When you get to your postdoc, you want to get started on a project that's going to yield data from the start. And so I think that's an important part of picking a postdoc and picking a project, is not going into it knowing what a good project is and knowing what a bad project is. And so, you know, there's probably exceptions to that, but I think as a general rule, yeah, the longer you're a postdoc, the more the expectation is for the number of publications you need to have, the more it is expected that at that point that you should be more independent, that you should have gotten funding on your own. Whereas when you're a postdoc who's been a postdoc 2-3 years, it's, you know, people just know that's not enough time for you to have published, you know, 12 papers. The bar is sort of proportionally lower. Still high, but lower.
I mean, if I had to redo my PhD at the end of my PhD, it would not have taken me 5 years. It would have taken me 1.5, maybe. I mean, everybody makes a lot of mistakes when you're a student, and that's because you're a student, you're learning. When you're a postdoc, even if you're switching fields, there's an expectation that you're more familiar with the scientific process, and that that's not going to require another 5 years to complete a similar project. That's what I've heard, at least. Something that has helped me too is not just from the research perspective, but if you're a postdoc, you should be starting to think about how to structure grant writing and writing grants, and there are a few foundations, especially private foundations, that will fund transition awards. So they'll give you some money for your postdoc years, and they'll give you some funding for your faculty years. And if you're applying for jobs, and in your cover letter you can say, I'm bringing this much money to your institution, that's huge. I'm now realizing that even those grants are relatively small. They'll support maybe one student. But it's more than just the funding. It's the ability to show that you can write a successful grant and that you can compete for it, and that you're already taking that initiative as a postdoc, that you're doing faculty-like things.
What about, on the same topic, what about the kind of people doing a second postdoc or a third postdoc? Does that make you more competitive for academic positions?
I think it's very field specific, right? I said in some areas where I am in, you don't even do a postdoc, right? You go right out of grad school. So I hear these things again from sort of the biology area. And from where I sit now is, I would say, it's like, you know, what is the added benefit, right? What do you actually, how do you actually increase your competitiveness? What does it allow you to do that you weren't able to do before, right? Is this a third postdoc because you've been applying for the past 3 cycles and you didn't get a, you know, faculty position? Or is there something that is actually, you know, something very tangible that's coming out that allows you to do things that other people can't do, that don't have these different experiences? Right? But again, I think it's very field specific. In some areas, if you do 3 postdocs, it's a kiss of death. Right? In others, it might be not too unusual.
What advice do you have for couples who are applying for faculty jobs? Like, some people say you shouldn't mention them at all and only mention them at the very end. But now that there's Facebook and people go to conferences, it's really obvious to look up if you have a partner that's also on the market. I'm just curious, like, how should couples approach job searching?
So I was waiting for that question. So you're right. There are 2 schools of thought, right? From the opposite side, I was told a chairman cannot solve a problem that she doesn't know about, right? So it's a very, very, very difficult problem, right? And the more you can tailor your search to begin with, you know, in the same region, same area, the better. right? But obviously, it's a very difficult problem to find. One academic position is difficult. To find two in potentially even the same area in the same region is essentially impossible. But so I think up front you can actually do a little bit of homework, because many universities will actually now state specific policies of what they will do in these kinds of situations. You can also ask people that you might know at particular universities that you interview what their policies might be before you actually go. Right? In the end, my approach was to say, look, it is what it is, right? I mean, if we'll say that this is a problem and that it is a two-body situation, and then collectively we'll try to figure it out. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it is a big problem. So I think again, the more intelligence that you can get up front is how a university actually deals with that kind of a problem, whether it has been solved in the past. I think that's good. MIT now, I think the School of Engineering, I don't know whether it's MIT-wide, but they will engage job consultants in these cases, where they say, well, if you have a two-body problem, we'll give us the CV of your spouse, and we'll actually work with someone to see whether we can actually find a job in the Boston area, not necessarily in academia, right? But MIT has a lot of connections to the local industry, so and they engage people to actually do that. So, but it is, I mean, my personal experience and my personal preference now is to say up front, it's like this, it is what it is, right? You and your partner or your spouse, do you want to be apart, right? Can you see one of you guys being as an acceptable option, one of you guys being on the West Coast, the other person on the East Coast, or is this out of the question? Right? If it's out of the question, you might as well raise it at the beginning.
So in my experience, my partner's in industry, and so for us, I found the process to be very flexible. So you should know that questions about your personal life, children, partnerships, marital status are illegal on an interview. Out of the 11 interviews I had, 9 asked me about marital status, children, plans to have children. And to be fair, I think most of them were very well-intentioned. So we'd be having dinner, and they'd start talking about where their kids go to school, and they'd mention, oh, by the way, this neighborhood isn't a great school district. Oh, by the way, it wasn't meant to be, I think, in any way a deciding factor in my candidacy. But just so you're aware, if you are interviewing, it's I found fairly common. The approach I took to that is that if you're asked an illegal question, you're legally not required to answer it truthfully. So if you feel uncomfortable with any of those questions, you don't have to answer them. But I would not be aggressive about raising those issues personally. But after the fact, after you have an offer in hand, every place that I had an offer in hand was very, very accommodating to circulating my partner's CV throughout the department, beyond the department, connections, trying to set them up with jobs. So that process I found to be really welcoming.
My question is about time management. So there are a lot of things we need to do for the application, and we have to do our own research. So what do you think will be a good pipeline for the coming few months that we could apply?
Timeline. Out of my own experience, the longest, most iterations you go through with your research statement, right? So, the CV is fairly straightforward. I mean, it's a form, right, that you just fill out with facts, essentially. The teaching statement is fairly straightforward. The research statement is what takes the longest to draft, to refine, to reiterate on, to get feedback on, and so on. So it depends on how well do you write, how much of that story is aligned, right? Some areas of science and engineering have a very, coordinated deadline that all the ads come out essentially at the same time. Others are drawn out, right? So if you're in one of the ones that's drawn out, you know that the first ads come out maybe sometime in September. There's your timeline. You decide where you are, right? And how long does it take you to actually come up with a research statement? But that's where I would actually prioritize. Make sure that is as good as you can get it. The rest you can usually pull together on fairly short notice.
I mean, I knew my letter of recommendation writers relatively well, so I went the route of asking people who knew me well. And what I would say is oftentimes, and they're professors, they're busy, and I'd say, I'm going to write an outline for you, outlining the points that I think you would be best to talk about with regards to your relationship to me. So I would hand them essentially a very point-by-point draft of a letter and say, you can use this if you want, or you can write your own from scratch, but here's essentially what I feel you'd be best to talk about.
I didn't do that, but I think that's a great idea, and I wouldn't hesitate to do that. It's never, I mean, you don't have to be pushy about it. You can just say, here's, I know you're busy, here's a summary of sort of what I think are the highlights of the time that I've worked with you and the things that I've done especially well. You can use it if you want. You're not obligated to, and just give it to them. And it's, I've actually had students do that for me who need a letter of recommendation for me, and it's always really. I'm never offended by it. I always find it really helpful. Actually, I don't cut and paste from it, but it's useful just to have it as a reminder. So,
and if there's something, goes, I guess, without saying that obviously your recommenders will get the full package that you will send to the university, right? So they have your research statement, their teaching statement, all that. But you're free to actually add to that, right? Not only the talking points, which is an excellent idea, but also other activities that may not made it into the CV or so that you feel that they should actually know, or personal details that they may have heard about a long time ago, but that speak to your perseverance and other things that you might want to point out.
I'll actually use the microphone. I was wondering about the negotiations side of things. You said you had 11 offers in hand.
Interviews.
Okay, so do you have advice for if they want to give just a verbal offer before they start negotiating? And because I've heard that that's something you should try to avoid, but I don't know what you do if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that part of the process can get a little tricky, and the offers will come essentially around the same time, which, or at least that was my case. So I had, I actually withdrew after an interview because I just felt like the faculty were great, the school was great, but I just didn't see a fit. And so after I interviewed, I said, probably best to open it up to another candidate. But of the remaining offers that I had, in my negotiations, I was very transparent. So I would have phone conversations, and I could tell some search committee chairs were a bit more hesitant to send me something by email than they would be by phone. And I would always ask whenever they would give me numbers, is it okay if I share these numbers with competing offers? And they all said yes. I made a spreadsheet. I was very transparent with everybody and essentially said, this is what I'm being offered elsewhere, and this is essentially, you can't have, you don't want to be pushy or greedy. Like I asked for what it would take to get a lab up and running. I didn't ask for more or less. And then when it came time to negotiate the things that are a little bit less tangible, like salary, benefits, how many students, you can negotiate on just about anything. That's where I said, well, this school's offering me this much, so they're already giving me a head start on my potential success. Would it be possible to match that?
I mean, that is obviously exceedingly important, right? And particularly in the current funding climate. In the best of cases in my field, it takes probably about a year to get your first independent grant, and that means that you're flying through with colors and everything, and everybody says bravo in the review process, right? So usually it's about a year and a half or so. So in terms of startup packages, I think, and negotiations that revolve around that, is you have to put yourself in the position that realistically it'll take a few years for your grants to come in, right? And so you want to go to a place that will set you up for success during that period, right? Until you actually start to build your own reputation and you start to build your own grant portfolio. So that's one thing. So what does it actually take in your field to be successful, to hit the ground running, and to actually start with these kinds of projects that we've talked about, right? The other thing is that ultimately when comes promotion time, you will be compared to others in the field in your same area. And so the question to ask yourself is who would be your competitors who already are in faculty positions, and what kind of resources, access to resources do they have? And some resources might be shared through the department or through the school or through a center or a laboratory, right? And that's fine. You don't have to get the 5th confocal microscope if they already have 4 sitting around that you can actually share. But make sure that they actually tell you that you can actually share it, right? And that there's no charge associated with that. Or if there's a charge associated with that, put that into your offer, right? But the bigger point is, what would it take for you to have a reasonable chance to compete with the other people in your same level, in your field? And if a school comes in at half of that level, right, then they're not setting you up for success, right? But I did the same thing. It's like I didn't ask for more than I thought I realistically needed for that. Hindsight, you can always use more, right? But I think it was fair. And I also agree, everything is negotiable, right? And if someone does not want to negotiate, that's not a good sign from the start, right? It's not just that they offered you something and now you're on the hook, that they want to be willing to actually accommodate you and make sure that the next 2 or 3 years of your career are the most productive and most successful right off the bat.
So it's when you're applying for a job and you get an offer, you sort of say, wow, fantastic. But I was really lucky. And you might be a little shy about asking for things. From the other side, this committee has been working for a year. They have gone through hundreds of applications. They have found you. You are the best they could find in the entire world. So remember that. You're in a strong position to negotiate for what you need. I think the advice is great that you just heard. But don't be shy. The other thing that sometimes you might consider, okay, you have this job, assistant professor, starting September. The tenure clock starts then. Teaching responsibilities might start then. And you say to yourself, I wish I had a little longer. One thing you can think about negotiating is say, look, I'm going to take the job, I'm going to sign on the dotted line, but I'm not going to start for an extra year. I want you to appoint me in a non-tenure instructor rank. I want you to give me space. I want you to let me have time to write my grants, to get my lab set up, and to finish a few papers before the tenure clock and this teaching and the other responsibilities start. That doesn't cost them much at all, except
They can't make you teach that year. But it can be enormously helpful to you to get started in a new environment. Something to think about.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice.
That's what I'm doing now, and it's that's probably the best thing I negotiated.
Another thing you shouldn't do is don't accept an offer and then continue to negotiate other offers. I had a friend who did that. He got a job offer in one place. He was like, oh, it's good enough. I'll accept it. And then he continued to interview at other places. And the place that offered him the job found out, got really upset, withdrew their offer, and he ended up getting no job. So don't do that.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and then we're going to call it quits. So is the question essentially, is it better to apply to the institutions which you have some network already established, or? Okay. Okay.
Well, so I wouldn't, I chose places to apply based on where I felt that my work was going to be a best fit. And again, that was with pre-existing research that the faculty was doing, the resources that were available on those campuses. So automatically that highlighted certain places and put others out of the running. This is really also the first time in my career where I'm choosing a place that I'm going to stay, hopefully, for many, many years. So the location was also important to me. And yeah, culture is definitely reflected pretty strongly, especially even if you think domestic applications, there's a big difference whether you're living in Texas versus Chicago versus Bay Area or even out east. So that became a consideration. And again, with my partner, where my partner could find a job became a consideration as well. So all of these things played into my my applications.
I know in my department here at MIT, there's a much higher bar for people who've already got training at MIT. And so we don't hire, for example, postdocs who are currently here. And you'll be considered if you went somewhere else, like if you were a graduate student here and you went away to do your postdoc somewhere completely different, or if you were a postdoc here, but then you went away for a postdoc and again did something very different. So maybe different departments have a different view on that, but I know in my department it would not look good to have somebody who's just all they've ever been as institutions in the Boston area. It would be considered too narrow, and they would want somebody who has more outside influence. They don't want the department to be too homogenous, and so they want people who've been influenced by thought processes at other institutions.
Yeah, so I actually did my PhD, my postdoc, my research scientist, all here at MIT, but unbeknownst to me at the time, I did it I maneuvered through MIT in a way that none of these entities that I was associated with really considered me, coming up through their ranks, right? And I think that played a role, or I was told that played a role when I applied to IMSS, and I interviewed there because even though I had gotten my PhD there, I hadn't been involved and I wasn't with IMSS for long enough so that they actually didn't consider me an internal hire.
Because it didn't exist.
Well, HST existed, but yeah, I mean, it's 90-some% of the faculty got rolled over, right? But at any rate, so keep in mind that the question that will be asked is, to what extent are you different from the people who trained you, right? So if you have evolved through your own trajectory, to be different, then, many places will consider you, right? But I think the notion is exactly what Kai said, is that you actually go somewhere, right? And another piece of advice that I was told, if you go somewhere else, you increase your fan base, right? If you stay at the same place, the same people are rooting for you. But if you go somewhere else, you have fans elsewhere.
Okay, let's give a very warm round of applause to the panelists. Thank you. We have refreshments outside on the bench, so on your way out, if you want to chat and mingle and grab some, you're more than welcome to. Thank you again.